Everybody, welcome back for episode 8. And I'm joined by the one and only John Peters here today. John is, wow, so he is a master resilience coach. He's experienced as a licensed clinical social worker and works with entrepreneurs, high performers, and professionals in high demand roles. Focuses on things like stress reduction, improving relationships, productivity. And I know, John, you recently launched the Alchemy Project, a coaching community that helps entrepreneurs. So, anyway, I would love for you to give us a brief introduction. Tell us more about yourself. How did you get into this space? And we can go from there.
Sure. Well, I've been a mindfulness-based therapist for 3 decades, and I also have done a variety of other gigs in the mental health space. One of which was I worked for 5 years at a hospital. So I was working in the critical care department and the emergency department. And both as a therapist, but especially in that high acute medical setting context, part of what I have been blessed with is actually getting to engage with people when they're facing all sorts of hells in their life. Sometimes chronic stress from grief or work burnout or things like that. But in that medical setting, all sorts of real acute stressors as well. So for me, I may not be the highest sensation seeker, but I really have liked being on. I have a job where for 30 years, I have yet to have a single boring day at work. Not one has ever happened. And so that's demanded that I learn certain things to help people. And my main mission, leave the world a better place than I found it. But how I got to where I was today in terms of working with entrepreneurs and people in high demand jobs is that about 15 years ago, I started branching out from only being a therapist and doing some entrepreneurial side projects. So I ended up writing 3 books. I published a couple of online courses, and over time ended up kind of morphing into the coaching space, partly because in the United States, a lot of people go to therapy who don't really need therapy. They're not frankly mentally ill, but they need support. They want to be resilient. They want to thrive. They want to improve their lives. And so, as a therapist, a decent amount of what I do is actually coaching. And that's because people don't think about coaches. They don't wake up and say, I'm going to go get some coaching, right? But people do wake up and say, I'm not sleeping well for a while, or I'm drinking too much, or my wife and I are fighting too much, or I hate my job, or I feel like I'm burning out, and things like that. And so the first thing people think of, usually if they think I'm going to get any sort of help at all, is let me go see a therapist, right? So I have people actually coming to me to use me as a guide and a coach quite a bit of the time, simply because I'm a therapist, right? And so in the more recent years, in the last couple of years, I decided that I was going to more formally pivot somewhat into the coaching space. And part of the reason I actually work with entrepreneurs is that once I got a little more serious about trying to build a side hustle that was more than a side hustle, more of a pivot, I realized I have to learn how to make YouTube videos. I have to learn how to do marketing. I have to learn how to make graphics for my ads. And the list goes on and on and on about all the different aspects of running a business when you're just you doing the thing. And so I thought, man, entrepreneurs, including me, we're all stretched thin because we're using our time and energy mostly to make up for capital. Of course, there are some people out there who might have $500,000 for a business venture, but you're kind of flying along at the seat of your pants. A lot of us, like me too, are keeping their day jobs. And so we're flying along with thin margins, and life is already stressful. So I thought, I'm living this experience and I've been working with people with that type of experience. So I want to specialize as a resilience coach with special insight in order to be able to guide people to not only cope with stress and avoid burnout, but to be able to thrive, to be able to have meaningful and positive relationships with their work. And another thing that I share with Maxwell, and one reason I joined Maxwell's group is that for me, I don't think it's enough to help individuals function better, like to just fix problems for single people in single situations. I actually want to make the world a better place. And I think that if I'm not doing well, then all the people connected to me probably aren't doing as well either. And if I do better, everybody I touch potentially could do better. So I think when one of us is lifted up, we all rise. And that's my core mission is to work in this space, but not only to help individual entrepreneurs, but to make the whole thing better.
Yeah, no, that's an awesome mission, and like especially with your diverse background in work and what you've worked in like all these different settings, right? And it's cool how you ended up where you are. Another thing that I think about is when you're like working with entrepreneurs, especially is like you get the return like for the time you put in to help them out, especially because it's like so stressful in there. You get the return on what they're doing as well to make the world a better place, as you said. So that's what's really cool about what you're doing, and especially like I know it's something that a lot of entrepreneurs need, and think about a lot of the time. So I'm just wondering, like, what specifically do you like? What are like some themes you've noticed when working with these entrepreneurs and helping them as a master resilience coach? Like, what are like kind of the things you'd put into practice?
Well, I think that one of the interesting challenges of working in this space is that a lot of people don't really recognize how thin their margins are. And it's kind of like the analogy of a frog being boiled in water, right? Like a frog doesn't really jump out because the water's only progressively getting hotter and hotter until it's too hot and then it's too late. I think a lot of entrepreneurs, and me included, we just adjust to the fact that I'm basically going to work long hours. I'm going to work 7 days a week because, things are important and resources are thin. And we kind of adjust to the fact that it's a stressful life. And so I think one of the messages I try to get out is like, how do you build self-awareness so that you can actually gauge when you need to do something about something? Because if you don't have good self-awareness, and I call it feedback loops, then you're not going to actually take an action, including getting a coach or seeing a therapist or doing wellness techniques like that. My messages to entrepreneurs is you need to have appropriate self-awareness. And I think that in society, we're not taught that. It's kind of like the O2 sensor in your car. If you reach under the hood and pull that out, your car will still run, but it's not going to have the right fuel oxygen mixture to have good mileage or good power. But if that sensor's plugged in, you have feedback, you have proper feedback, and then the computer can regulate that in a synthetic manner, and your car actually has better mileage and better power. And so I think that a lot of people aren't paying attention to themselves well in order to make the adjustments that they need to make to perform well. The other thing is, I think in our dominant paradigm of mental health, a lot of people, again, they just think, I'm not going to do anything until I'm like so anxious that I can't sleep at all or I'm having panic attacks. But I think also a lot of people think, well, if I get to the point where I need some help, then it must be some deep-seated problem. I got to spend 30 years on the couch talking about my mother or something like that to fix. But the reality is a lot of simple things can be fixed in a straightforward manner without necessarily doing the traditional therapy paradigm. Let me give you an example. So this dude came to me one time and he shows up in my therapy practice and I'm like, why are you here? And he's like, well, I think I have imposter syndrome. I'm burning out and my life is like going to hell. And so I asked him, well, what's up? And so he said, well, I just got this promotion. It was like my dream promotion at work. I've been wanting it for years. I finally got this promotion. And I'm like 2 months into this promotion and I'm working long hours. I'm finding it really difficult, even though it's a job that I've wanted for a long time and I actually love. But I'm finding that more nights than not, I come home and I'm fighting with my wife or my kids minutes after I get home. And I've started drinking more. I used to be a low level drinker and now I'm drinking daily. And mostly what I want to do when I go home is actually hide. So I'm playing video games and I'm on my phone all the time. I'm spending no time with my family. And I'm starting to like dread every day because every day is like, right? So A, I didn't think he had imposter syndrome because he seemed competent to me. B, he wasn't an alcoholic even though he was drinking a little too much, right? C, he wasn't really frankly depressed or anything like that. I thought, and he also, he lacked a little confidence, but it wasn't only a confidence issue. I thought it was a resilience issue. And so over a couple of weeks, I taught this dude some techniques that literally take like 5 minutes to learn and 5 minutes to do. And 2 weeks later, he comes back to me and says he's not yelling at his kids when he comes home. He's gone back to his normal level of drinking. He's sleeping better. He's not spending too much time playing video games anymore. And he's not dreading his days. So I think, again, why did that happen? We plugged in the right feedback mechanisms for him. We gave him some simple ways to bolster his resilience. And the whole thing, which was already pretty much working, just reset itself. And he was doing better at that point.
Wow, that's awesome. Yeah, that's a good example there, John. Thank you. Now you touched on some of these already, but what are some of the primary factors that's driving this stress among entrepreneurs and professionals? I know we live in a gig economy. A lot of people deal with burnout. How does mindfulness and cognitive behavioral techniques kind of address some of this stuff? And how does resilient coaching play a role in this too?
Sure. So here's one thing that I teach people when I'm doing like my basic stress management 101. And I used to do this with students because one of the things I didn't tell you is for 15 years, I taught a full semester stress management class at Indiana University. I had thousands of students who went through that. So I had the wonderful opportunity to teach them about this stuff too. But here's the thing. We think about stress times time as the equation. So I've got a certain amount of stress. It goes on for a certain amount of time, and that's my stress load. However, it's really stress times time times the fatigue factor. Because as you know, when you got an ongoing stressor, you get worn out by it, right? And why do you get worn out by it? Because there's no recovery time at any point. It's unrelenting. It goes on and on. So even if you clock out of a busy job or you go home and you're trying to play video games or do something else, that stressor is hanging out there, contributing more than you want. And since it's not going completely away, then you don't get recovery. So you don't reduce the fatigue factor. So it's still stress times time times fatigue, which is not the multiplier you want in play too long without getting recovery, right? And even when people take like a week vacation, they don't stop thinking about their stressors for the whole week. So do they get recovery? No, they don't, right? So one of the things that mindfulness does and the techniques that I teach is I teach ways that you truly can get that recovery from that unremitting stress, even if it's something that is unresolved. So maybe I got a project, it's not done, but in the middle of it, when I'm not working and I don't need to be focused on it, I want to not be focused on it. I don't want mental chatter in my head, and I don't want worry about what's happening tomorrow, and I don't want rumination about what happened yesterday. I want to be able to unhook from that. And that's not something that people can easily do with no training, but it is something that people can very easily do with very little training. I mean, in minutes, actually, I teach people some basic techniques that actually change that chatter, they change the worry, they change the rumination. And once you lower that, it's significant. The stress reduction is significant because you change the equation.
No, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, thank you, John.
The other thing I would say is that if you think about stress on a scale of 1 to 10, our goal in order for you to function better is not to drop you to 1. Our goal is actually to drop you most of the time below your upper threshold. So let's think of it this way: code green, code yellow, code orange, code red. Okay. At codes green, yellow, and orange, all of us are going to continue to function pretty well. It's when we go to code red that our performance drops off. So what's the answer? It's not to figure out how to be in some sort of masterful Zen state where you're always in code green. It's stay out of code red, stay under that threshold, right? And so the techniques that I teach actually are aimed at making sure that even if we get to upper orange, we don't flip over that threshold into red. Because when I interview people and I talk like, what's bothering you most of the problems that people report, like the drinking too much, not sleeping well, having panic attacks, fighting with your wife and things like that, all of those are code red symptoms. They're not usually code green, yellow, and orange symptoms. So if I can just keep you from going to code red, even if you're getting to yellow and orange, your life improves 1,000%.
That's great, man. Thank you.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And there's a healthy level of stress, a level of stress that's going to push you to grow. Without any stress, you're just probably going to flatline,
Right.
or
Or die like in
plateau.
the Matrix, right?
Yeah, yeah. And so when it comes to, let's say you're working with a client and they have, XYZ goal, how do you help them kind of maintain that laser beam focus and stay productive on track towards that goal, even in high levels of stress, whether that be relational, from the workplace. How do you kind of keep them focused and on track?
Sure. So I dabble a little bit in the niche that I would call executive coaching, but I'm not actually an executive coach. So I do kind of like cursory organizational one-on-one stuff to support people in being a little better organized and focused. However, because of the thing that I just said about that code orange, code red threshold, what I find is that 90% of the people I work with, if we can just change the percentage of time that they're flipping up into code red and the percentage of time that they are mentally glued into that unremitting worry and rumination, whatever they're doing is going to work way better, right? Now, can we tweak their organizational stuff? Sure, and I teach kind of garden variety stuff. I'm not actually a masterful organizational coach. Um, but people can get that elsewhere. You can read a book and get that. You can go see a career coach and get stuff like that. You can go take a study skills class and get that. But my superpower is how do we get all the noise out of the way? So the stuff that you already know how to do, your capacities you've already developed actually work really well for you. Because most people, if we clear out a bunch of that noise, their performance goes way up.
Yeah,
That's
it
Yeah.
makes
good.
sense.
Um, yeah. I was just thinking, John, about like you've been talking a lot about code red, right? And all these different things. And I know you have this like different approach kind of to mindfulness compared to let's say like the traditional way that mindfulness is generally thought about, which is right, like ground yourself for like 10 or so plus minutes, right? I know you approach it a bit differently and it your technique is really interesting. If I'm wondering if you want you're willing to share that to the people watching this and share kind of your perspective on this because I'm sure people will be very interested in what you have to say there.
Sure. So here's the background and why I teach the technique that I do. So when I was young, I was super stressed out. I was an anxious person born into an anxious family in a completely messed up situation. I'm not going to go and get into the weeds of that right now, but it was messed up. And so by the time I was a teen, I was using drugs, I was doing reckless stuff, and I was frankly really anxious. I was having panic attacks. I couldn't sleep well. I just wasn't functioning really well. So I decided that I need to fix that. So I went on a 10-year journey, pretty intensively studying a variety of forms of meditation and yoga and Tai Chi and massage and all different sorts of things like that. And the good news for me was I actually figured out a whole bunch of things that made my world way, way better. But then after that 10 years, I became a therapist. So I'm all gung ho at that time to share mindfulness techniques and meditation and alternative medicine stuff with my clients. And the wonderful thing is my clients were coming back to me and saying, John, you're full of BS and nothing you're teaching us works. And I had to figure out, I know this stuff works, right? So why is none of the stuff that I'm teaching people working? Which is when I figured out my basic plan. So my basic plan is based on 3 F's: foundation, fitness, and feasibility. And that last F is the one that's going to answer your question. Foundation is just doing basic wellness practices to make sure that you're doing what you can to not be too stressed, like good exercise, good sleep, not drinking too much coffee and alcohol and stuff like that. Fitness is the goal that we're aimed at, which is, can we change your brain so your brain is more fit in those moments where you need it to help you perform better? But the last one, feasibility, is the one that I had to learn. It was a hard lesson to learn because I was trying to teach people the stuff that I knew worked, and I was chunking it down. I wasn't asking them to do what I was doing, because at the time I was doing 40 minutes a day every morning, right? I knew I couldn't ask people to do that, but I would ask people to do 10 minutes, right? They would come back and say they didn't do it. I would ask them to do 5 minutes. They would come back and say they didn't do it, right? So I started exploring it myself, plus talking to a lot of long-term meditators basically in the Zen Buddhist space. That I've got a lot of colleagues in that space. And one of the things that we were talking about and that I figured out is, what's the minimally viable amount of practice that you can do in order to get these stress reduction techniques that people get from meditation? Because if we could figure that out and make it feasible, then people would actually do it. And if they actually did it, they would get the results. So what I figured out after working with actually thousands of people with this pressure of having to be feasible was that if I taught them a particular mindful breathing technique that only took 1 minute, then people would do it. And then I thought they should do that 5 times a day to get at least 5 minutes, because A, that spreads it out through the day, and B, it gives them a cumulative 5 minutes per day, which means per week they're getting 35 plus minutes of practice. And it turns out that is enough. 90% of my clients who actually do that come back within 1 week and say that their anxiety is lower and that they're sleeping better and they're coping with stuff better, right? So I'll share what the technique is, because it's actually not mysterious. It's just that people don't do it because people think they got to go buy a cushion and sit in the lotus position for 40 minutes to get the effect. And you don't. That's the good news, right? So here's the technique. Here's the secret sauce for how to rewire your brain in a week, right? Of course, results may vary at home. But so for 1 minute, literally 60 seconds, you just relax your body. Just relax. Then you tune your mental focus into your chest and belly and watch the movement of your breath. You don't change it, you just watch. So we're relaxed. We're just watching that movement. If you feel tension or awkwardness or impatience arise, ignore it. Just go back to relaxation and watching the breath. And then the last component, and this is important or it won't work as well. Every time you breathe in, silently to yourself, not out loud, you're going to say in. Every time you breathe out, silently in your head, you're going to say out. And again, don't change the breath to match the words. Only say in when you're breathing in and only say out when you're breathing out in your head. And you do that for 1 minute. That helps unhook you from your chatter, your mental noise, because in and out tie up the word part of your brain. And you need the word part of your brain to drive your chatter, your rumination, your worry. But we're giving it something to do that's simple and neutral in tone. And we do that for a minute. And then sometime later in the day, we do another minute, another minute, another minute, right? Do 5 or more of those a day. And I've had miraculous results from that, right? I'll give you a story. I saw this patient one time in her 70s, and I said, of course, why are you here, when I met her? And she's like, well, I have multiple panic attacks a day, and they've been going on my whole life. I've seen therapists for years. Nobody's helped. I have taken all these drugs from doctors. Nothing will stop these panic attacks, right? So I heard you specialize in anxiety. I was like, okay. So I taught that technique to this patient, right? See her a week later, and I was like, how many panic attacks have you had in the last week? And she said, one. I said, one a day? She's like, no, one in a week, right? So went from decades of multiple panic attacks a day to one a week, right? And that's one of many stories. I could like we could talk till the cows come home about that type of result. But that technique rewires your brain. And it's not something I teach people to do when they're panicky or when they're anxious to calm down. You just do it like exercise, and it makes your brain more fit, just like exercise. And if you're more fit, then you're more fit even when you're not at the gym. And if your brain is more fit, it's more fit even when you're not doing the breathing, right? So in 5 minutes a day, you can rewire your brain in a week.
That is so great. I'm definitely going to try that, John. Thank you for sharing that with everybody. Do you have any other practical tips, techniques for reducing stress, overwhelm, burnout? Any other hacks you could think of?
Yeah, I mean, I'll tell you an easy one because it's such a common one. This isn't like the final word for everybody, and it's because it's not the main issue. But the reality is, a lot of people are drinking too much caffeine. Caffeine stimulates the stress response. Do I love it? Yes. Do I drink coffee every morning and tea in the afternoons? Yes. But I will tell you that I always ask people how much caffeine they're drinking, and if they're telling me they're drinking a 2 liter Mountain Dew every day, you got to cut that down, right? So the simplest thing without doing anything really other than just changing one part of your diet is lower caffeine. And it doesn't mean you have to quit it. Plus, caffeine withdrawal sucks. But cutting it by 25% for most people actually will take the edge off your stress if you find that you're kind of like more on one of those edges where you're having panic attacks and where your sleep isn't good and you start to feel, frankly anxious. Usually lowering caffeine a bit. But if you want the real deal, do the mindful breathing. And if you want to learn more techniques like that, my group's free, and anybody's welcome to join my group, and I teach that kind of stuff too.
What about for someone who's highly addicted to caffeine? I found myself rather addicted to caffeine. So, what if they're struggling with reducing their intake?
Just do it slowly. Don't do
Hmm.
it fast. I mean, like if you're drinking like 2 pots of coffee a day, either start mixing 10% decaf in your mix or drink 1 cup less in a day. Because if you try to cut down, you're not going to die from it, but you'll feel like you have the flu if you miss caffeine too much and you're drinking too much.
It's
Cool.
kind of the
Thank you.
theme of sorry, Tim. Kind of like the theme of like your approaches is this like a lot of people wait when you struggling with anxiety or something, it's kind of like this all or nothing kind of approach, right? When you do deal with these symptoms and all this stuff. So what I like about what you're doing kind of is like it's regarding caffeine or whatever, you really take it like as slow progress as it gets. Like and that's like a lot of the time it can be too overwhelming, especially if you're in a severe anxiety point or something like that, right? So like really just doing like 1 minute a day, 5% lower in caffeine. That stuff was is more feasible, like you were saying, that step about feasibility. So yeah, I just wanted to ask about if you could talk more about kind of like your group and your coaching community for entrepreneurs. Can you tell us more about your initiative and the objectives there, what you were trying to work on?
Sure. Yeah, so I started the Alchemy project partly because I want to get this out to more people. And I've had the blessing of doing it with thousands of people in my therapy practice and when I taught at Indiana University. But um, part of the goal is to disseminate more of these easy to learn techniques and also to give people basic education about just what is stress, how does it affect me, what are some ways that I can improve that. I also want the group to be a place where I can share a little deeper practice, which is like those feedback loops that I was talking about earlier, because there's some really simple things that people can learn to basically plug in better feedback inputs in their normal functioning so that their normal regulation actually works better for them. So that's part of my goal. In May, so coming up pretty soon in a few weeks, I'm actually launching a group coaching community. So it's going to be a little more intense work with a little closer work with me through a group coaching format. So that's going to be the Alchemy Project Mastery Group that's going to launch in May. I'm going to keep the Alchemy Project group going. I'm going to keep working with it mostly as I am now, and it's going to stay free for people.
Awesome. And yeah, if we love if you could share, where can we find you? Where can everyone listening find you?
Sure. The easiest way to find me is alchemyproject.online. So Alchemy Project, one word, .online. That site has a link to my Skool community, and it also has a link to my new podcast that I just launched, which is called Alchemy Project Online on YouTube. So on there, I'm going to be interviewing people about how they handle stress, how they thrive, especially entrepreneurs and business owners and executives. So that's what that channel's about. But alchemyproject.online is the easiest way to find me.
Awesome, awesome. And what can everyone kind of expect when they first get into the group, into the Skool group, for example? What's kind of like step one?
Step one is I invite people to actually commit to a challenge where they're going to do a few days of the thing that I shared with you earlier, so the mindful breathing. And part of the reason for that is it's so easy to learn, easy to implement, and starts giving noticeable results for most people within a few days. So part of what I guide people in the onboarding process is orienting them toward that practice. And then I guide them into some deeper lessons about what is stress, how do we understand it, how do we understand self-appraisal, self-awareness, and those feedback mechanisms so that people can continue the practice. And I'm in the community too, continuing to guide people. I also jump on one-on-one calls with people as needed in that community to make sure that people get the personalized support that they need.
Oh, that's great, John. The last minute or so, do you have any like last words for the viewers? Anything you want them to know?
Yeah, the thing you think is the worst part of your stress from the angle you're looking at it, maybe, but it's probably not. There's actually stuff that you can do with whatever you think your top three stressors are right now. And the reasons you think you can't fix that could be self-limiting beliefs, or you just haven't learned the right button to push on it. So the good news is I'm not the only person on the planet that knows how to fix that stuff. I encourage people, take the initiative, get a good coach or work with someone like me because you really can be more resilient. You can thrive, and you're an entrepreneur. You're going to continue to fly along with thin margins, but let's make that a more enjoyable process.
Awesome. Well, John, thank you so much for being on with us. We'd love to have you back at some point. And we're gonna send all the links below, everybody. So please check out John's Skool community, the website, and get plugged in. Thank you guys so much for watching. John, thanks again, and we will see you on the next one.
Cool. Thanks.
Thanks, John.
Mhm.
Absolutely.